to stop a church service. In Durban, police fired tear gas and water cannons at students. And in Johannesburg, anti-apartheid demonstrators were denied entry to hear F.W. de Klerk's last election speech of the campaign. This report has been compiled under the reporting restrictions imposed under South Africa's state of emergency.
On their way to F.W. de Klerk's final election rally, the uninvited, eager he should hear their views, even if they cannot vote. The leaders of the black trade unions didn't even reach the door of Johannesburg City Hall, turned back by police.
This is an illegal gathering, okay? So all of you can stay there, you can't come past. And then we're going to give you 10 minutes to disperse, otherwise you're going to take the necessary action.
But the leader of South Africa's mine workers said he thought Mr. de Klerk was addressing a public meeting.
I wanted to hand over this letter to the acting state president, ourselves, because we'd like to believe that as the acting state president of this country, he is entitled to hear the views of the majority of our people.
This isn't for anybody. We can decide, the party can decide who can come in and who not. But at the moment, this is illegal.
Mr. de Klerk arrived refusing to say anything about the demonstration. Inside, he could be sure of a rapturous reception from National Party faithful. But there weren't many of them to hear their leader's final campaign appeal. There were plenty of empty seats the trade unionists could have filled. As it was, Mr. de Klerk promised his all-white audience a new constitution to give the black majority a share in power.
I have stated over and over again, and I repeat it here tonight, white domination, in as much as it exists, must come to an end. That is the goal of the National Party. And in the very same breath, the National Party says, it is not prepared to exchange white domination with another form of domination.
But Mr. de Klerk also made clear his own commitment to maintain the principle of segregated suburbs, segregated state schools. Many in the black majority will continue to defy. Tomorrow, a general strike is planned. Tonight in Cape Town, police stifling all protest locked a choir out of Archbishop Tutu's cathedral, apparently convinced their concert was a political meeting. James Robbins, BBC News, Johannesburg.
There's been a fresh outbreak of fight.
While on the last day of the election campaign, Acting President F.W. de Klerk said tonight that discrimination must be eliminated. Kevin Dunn's report has been compiled under government restrictions.
The security crackdown intensified from early morning, police sealing off central Johannesburg to make sweeping searches. The operation aimed at stopping disruption of elections which exclude the black majority, but which will almost certainly determine their future. Black opposition to the elections has been growing, and at 2 universities in Durban, protesters continued their defiance. So too did the police action against them, which government restrictions prevent us from showing. And as the white election campaign reached its climax, black trade unionists marched peacefully through Johannesburg to the City Hall, where Acting President F.W. de Klerk was to make his final election speech. Mr. de Klerk repeated his campaign pledge that the National Party, after 40 years in power, was now prepared to see the end in South Africa of white domination.
White domination, in as much as it exists, must come to an end. That is the goal of the National Party.
But he made clear he would not accept black majority rule.
And in the very same breath, the National Party says, it is not prepared to exchange white domination with another form of domination.
But the uncertainty of the party's reform plans is expected to drive some white voters to the right, where the Conservative Party is waiting. Its leader, Andries Treurnicht, is nicknamed Dr. No for his opposition to reform. He and his party are synonymous with so-called petty apartheid, a return to total segregation, which in practice means clearing blacks from white parks. Far from losing support, the Conservatives stand to make significant gains from the National Party by pledging to put blacks in tribal nations within South Africa.
If we don't govern ourselves, if black people are the majority in our government, then we become their slaves. We become dominated by them. So we cannot forfeit our rights to an own fatherland.
At the other end of the white political spectrum, Liberals are campaigning for total integration. The successors to Helen Suzman have regrouped in the new Democratic Party, with Dennis Worrell, a former ambassador to Britain, as charismatic co-leader. He's poised to enter Parliament and his party to take seats from the government with a simple message.
A message to our fellow black South Africans. And it's a simple message. It is white South Africans say, goodbye, good riddance, apartheid. We're ready to build the future together.
But the reality of the present tonight was a further wave of detentions at a Cape Town church. Among those held, the Reverend Alan Bursack. Other anti-apartheid activists trying to reach the meeting were turned away in buses. And when Archbishop Tutu later sought to intervene, he too was arrested for the second time in 4 days. Kevin Dunn, News at 10, Johannesburg.
Here, the bigger left Cape Cathedral, which was raided by police last night. He said he was reclaiming the church for God. This report has been compiled under the South African government's emergency restrictions.
St George's Cathedral, Cape Town, a service of reconsecration. Archbishop Desmond Tutu called last night's police action sacrilege, bursting in with guns and whips, breaking up a choral concert. Today, the Archbishop sanctified in particular the doorway his dean says was violated and profaned.
The police broke into the church carrying guns and quoits and wearing their heads in this holy place.
Never before has the government moved so strongly against the churches, wedging an armoured personnel carrier across the door of this Methodist church. A Supreme Court ruling declaring their actions unlawful came too late to stop police whipping people trying to attend a protest service. Elsewhere in Cape Town, police carry on removing any and every sign of dissent. For a few minutes, journalists stood silently outside their offices. But then, police, determined to maintain their crackdown, moved in to bundle the journalists away. The government showing its white supporters a firm hand ahead of tomorrow's poll. The elections divide even communities who do have a vote tomorrow. These school children denounced a local candidate for the racially segregated Indian Chamber, incensing an election supporter. In the black townships, the union's call for a general strike kept thousands away from work. Soweto railway stations normally thronged were almost empty. A symbolic blow at an economy already battered by sanctions and apartheid. Creeping poverty is the issue taken up by the white liberal opposition, hoping to weaken the National Party's 40-year hold on power. For this little boy, his only meal of the day. A handout at a Johannesburg soup kitchen. This is not the international image of white South Africa. These are victims of a failing economy, of rising unemployment and falling living standards. In this suburb, Jan Hofmeyer, the Afrikaners used to think poverty was the lot of black families. Their National Party, the guarantee of a job, dignity, superiority. Not anymore.
The family cut down on essentials, like meat, and still they were managing just.
But they couldn't keep up the mortgage payments. Over 21,000 families are threatened with packing up, leaving home.
Isn't it time we send this government packing? Vote DP.
But at the end of this campaign, DP predictions of heavy government losses of a hung parliament sound increasingly unrealistic. The latest slogan may be seductive, but it flies in the face of reality. The truth is, most white South Africans do vote their fears, not their hopes. Weeks of anti-government defiance have heightened white insecurity. Many uncertain voters moving towards the DP are believed to be swinging back behind the National Party government, with its track record putting down opposition. Security won the '87 election for the government. If the tide is turning, it looks like turning in the government's favour once more, putting F.W. de Klerk firmly on top. James Robbins, BBC News, Johannesburg.
The TUC
filed under the South African government's reporting restrictions.
In South Africa's townships, near empty streets and deserted bus stations were testimony to the start of a stay away from work by blacks protesting at their exclusion from tomorrow's election. And across the Republic, the protests continued, with white Afrikaner students symbolically gagging themselves in support of the majority who don't have a say. In a rare alliance, the cream of Afrikaner youth joined the black workers who served them in a protest which ended when police unleashed their dogs. On another campus, academics were arrested with their students for demonstrating at the crackdown on anti-election activity. The increasingly widespread protests have met with an increasingly harsh police response, a policy which may help the National Party stem a drift to the left, but it may lose even more votes to the right, giving its new president the slimmest majority since the National Party came to power 40 years ago. There's little doubt that acting President F.W. de Klerk will be the victor tomorrow, but his immediate concern then will be the future not so much of the whites who elect him, but of the black majority who have yet to win the vote. And tonight in the townships, the symbols of apartheid were set aflame. Black anger heightened by the government's unprecedented action against the church and its most respected leaders, who still hold the hope of change through peaceful protest. Kevin Dunn, News at 10, Johannesburg.
This latest clash between Archbishop Tutu and Cape Town police occurred after an armoured personnel carrier was deliberately parked against a church doorway, preventing him from entering.
What is the point of... This is a church. There's no church service tonight.
Minutes later, the Archbishop and the ITN camera crew were arrested. But there seems to be little to stop this charismatic clergyman, and after being released without charge, he made do with a few hours' sleep before climbing aboard his jogging machine, as usual, at 5 o'clock this morning. Time then for an hour's silent thought behind his desk in a study adorned with keepsake photographs, plus a framed letter this year from the jailed African National Congress leader, Nelson Mandela. At 7 this morning, maintaining his public profile, the 58-year-old Archbishop carried out a reconsecration ceremony at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. It was necessary to cleanse the building, he said, because police had earlier entered there, uninvited and armed. The Archbishop returned home to meet church colleagues to discuss more mundane matters. He began, though, by informing them of his latest brush with South Africa's law and order. He made clear nothing would deter him from his fight for reforms.
On the contrary, I mean, we've got them beat, really, because they don't actually know how to handle the situation. In one place, they try to use the velvet glove. In other places, it's the iron fist. And our people are determined.
When South Africa goes to the polls tomorrow, the Archbishop of Cape Town will be unable to vote because he is black. But Archbishop Tutu is firmly convinced his high-profile fight with the establishment will mean that when the country next decides, South Africans of every colour and creed will have their say. Terry Lloyd, News at 10, Cape Town.
It's reported from the polls. Our Southern Africa correspondent James Robbins has just sent this report compiled under the government's emergency restrictions.
Sealing the ballot boxes for South Africa's most unpredictable election in 40 years. With police deployed in force at every polling station, a heavy turnout is expected among the white minority, sharply divided between those who favour some form of power sharing with the black majority and those who favour a return to total apartheid. One of the first to vote in Pretoria, F.W. de Klerk, almost certain to be confirmed as president amid predictions his National Party will lose its powerful majority but not lose power.
I'm not a guesser. I work on facts and figures.
How do you feel today? Mr. de Klerk's foreign minister was more talkative, blaming Europe for any gains the far-right Conservatives do make today.
I blame governments, particularly in Europe, for not giving us credit for the many laws of discrimination that we have withdrawn. It is for that reason that you have such a relatively growing Conservative Party in this country today.
But the black majority give the government little credit either, leaving the streets deserted today, striking in greater numbers than yesterday to show their feelings about a poll over their future in which they have no part.
They are talking about us, and yet we do not participate in those elections, when what we are saying should happen is to have a new South Africa, which patently the majority of the people of this country want, a new South Africa where you have the vote for everybody.
To stop that view spreading in the streets, placard demonstrations today have been short-lived. Police and troops are swamping all the most troublesome townships to maintain the government image of a secure South Africa. White perceptions of the present government as best defenders of their security will almost certainly guarantee the National Party victory again tonight after 41 years continuous power. James Robbins, BBC News.